It's 4:13 a.m. Birmingham is asleep.
The gang imported high-purity cocaine from Mexico and concealed it in shipments of frozen meat, flooding UK streets with narcotics.
But in the shadows, something's moving. A white refrigerated van glides to a silent stop on an empty street. No sirens, no shouting, just frost in the air and tension thick enough to cut. Gloved hands reach for the handle. A breath is held. The doors swing open, boxes, frozen chicken. But inside those boxes, not drumsticks, not thighs, narcotics, bricks of it, over 150 kilograms. That's when the story started to demand attention. Coke hidden in poultry shipments. On the surface, it sounded absurd, but one question kept echoing. How does something like this even happen? Who put it there? Where was it going? And most of all, who was clever enough to pull it off and stupid enough to get caught? That's what we're going to find out. But fair spoiler, this isn't just about one truck. This was the first thread in a massive web. And as investigators pulled, it unravelled a story involving 10 men, encrypted phones, hidden compartments stuffed with cash and controlled substances ready for export halfway across the world. To Australia. Nothing about this was accidental. It was a methodical network, disguising narcotic shipments inside freezer staples that no one would question. So here's the puzzle I want you to solve with me. What's the one mistake that brought this entire gang down? It's in there, hidden amongst their code words, their chat logs, and a decision so small it seemed harmless, until it cracked everything wide open. This is the story of the frozen chicken coke gang, and together we're going to dissect every piece of it. But remember, each answer unlocks a new question. What looked like a single bizarre bust was actually the first crack in something far more elaborate, something that, layer by layer, was just about to reveal how deep this operation really went. It started quietly. No shootout, no sirens, just a van, a cargo manifest, and a hunch backed by encrypted whispers. In early July 2020, officers from the West Midlands Regional Organised Crime Unit were monitoring a stream of coded messages from a private channel they'd been watching for weeks. Most of the chatter was vague, but this one thread stood out. Something about a delivery, something urgent, something cold. The language was clipped, calculated, like the senders knew someone might be listening. So when a white refrigerated van rolled away from a port in Essex, heading towards Birmingham, a quiet team was already tracking it. It blended into traffic. There was no reason to look twice, unless you knew what to look for. Officers intercepted it not long after it hit the road. What they found inside would blow the lid off one of the UK's most unusual narcotic trafficking operations. Stacked inside were boxes of frozen chicken, standard packaging, clean labels, everything by the book. Buried within the meat were vacuum-sealed bricks, each one dense, anonymous and unmistakably illicit, over 150 kilograms of it. One of the largest single seizures ever made in the region, tens of millions of pounds in street value. And yet, this bust didn't feel like a climax, it felt like an opening move. Because if illegal substances were moving like this, wrapped in poultry and passed through public roads unnoticed, then what had already slipped through? That question hung in the air. Investigators knew what they'd caught, but they also knew what they hadn't. The technique itself was not new, using legitimate goods as cover, but this version had scale and sophistication. Detectives confirmed the gang had been transporting controlled substances in pallets of raw chicken for months, possibly longer. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Cook from the West Midland Police's Regional Organised Crime Unit called the gang's activities sophisticated and on a commercial scale, pointing out how they relied on a network of highly trusted individuals and a fleet of vehicles with hidden compartments to move their controlled substances and cash unnoticed. And they were just getting started. As search warrants followed and surveillance deepened, the scope of the operation came into focus. More illegal substances, much more, were uncovered in connected properties. Altogether, nearly 400 kilograms of high-purity coke was seized, and with it, £1.6 million in illicit cash, the tangible remnants of a distribution network already in motion long before that one van was stopped. Chief Inspector Pete Cook summed it up clearly. This far-reaching investigation covered the importation, exportation and wholesale national supply of coke and money laundering. The profits? Easily over £10 million. Far from a trial run, this was a full-scale distribution network, its shipments masked by goods as common as frozen chicken. No street dealing, no chaos, just quiet efficiency, until one encrypted message gave it all away. But here's the thing, if this was just the delivery system, who built the system itself? That answer, as we'll see, starts with encrypted phones and a mistake that no one in the gang saw coming. The brilliance of the scheme lay in its simplicity. Meat trucks don't raise eyebrows. A chilled van, grocery manifest, just another delivery between traffic lights, unremarkable by every measure. That's what made it work, and for a while, it worked flawlessly. Each vacuum-sealed brick was buried beneath invoice-backed groceries, undetectable, unless you knew where to look. The product moved under the guise of groceries, camouflaged by routine. It felt more like a supply chain than a smuggling ring, and that was intentional. The brilliance wasn't in disguise, but in dullness. No one flags frozen chicken. It was the kind of scheme that might have belonged to fiction. In fact, it did. Compare it to Breaking Bad's Los Palos Hermanos, methamphetamine hidden behind the front of a fried chicken business. The resemblance was too close to ignore. In one real-world case, 46 kilograms of coke was found in frozen chicken in Saudi Arabia. Criminals were literally inspired by the show. This was not fiction. This was Birmingham. Real, quiet, and deadly efficient. It echoed stories from television, but the damage it caused was anything but scripted. It was organised crime at its cleanest, its quietest, and its most dangerous. By the time the police connected the dots, by then poultry shipments had already masked hundreds of kilos crisscrossing the UK. But the method, as smart as it seemed, was never invisible. It left traces, patterns, choices, routines, and with every seized van, every hidden package, another piece of the picture came into view. What looked like isolated moves, an intercepted van, a coded message, a pallet of poultry, weren't random events. They were fragments of a larger puzzle, a system built to run silently, until the code behind it all began to crack. Because beneath the chicken, beyond the packaging and behind the perfectly wrapped bricks, was something else, a signal, a chat, an encrypted message no one was supposed to see, until someone did. And that's where everything began to unravel. Long before the van was stopped, long before the boxes were unpacked, the case was already underway. The group believed their operation was airtight. They had reason to think so. Every move, every deal, every piece of coordination ran through EncroChat, an encrypted messaging platform designed to protect its users from exactly the kind of attention they were drawing. The phones were specialised, stripped down and heavily secured. For criminals across Europe, this was the trusted system. But in the spring of 2020, without warning and without noise, that system collapsed. European authorities had silently breached EncroChat's network. The breach didn't just allow access to past messages, it opened a live feed into thousands of conversations happening in real time. Criminals kept typing, unaware someone else was reading. Janine van der Berg, the chief constable of the Dutch police's central unit, described the experience in plain terms. It was as if we were sitting at the table where criminals were chatting. In the UK, the breach sparked Operation Venetic, a sweeping campaign that would eventually identify more than 746 suspects, amongst them the men behind the frozen chicken shipments. Through their private conversations, investigators were able to map the entire structure of the syndicate. Logistics were laid out, timelines, distribution roles, financial trails. In one exchange, the gang discussed sourcing up to a ton of coke. In another, they referenced moving large amounts of criminal cash, later confirmed to exceed £10 million. Though the language was often veiled, the patterns weren't. Cross-referenced with live surveillance and forensic data, these messages became the skeleton of the case. West Midlands investigators used them to isolate players, track assets and anticipate movement. The chats revealed not just primary shipments, but alternative methods, backup drivers and fallback locations. The gang had no idea they were under watch. By the time their van was intercepted in Birmingham, officers already had an expanded list of targets, timelines and likely routes. There was no rush to intervene. It was a methodical takedown, executed piece by piece. For investigators, the EncroChat breach was a shift in tempo. It turned scattered clues into a working blueprint. One comparison kept surfacing. This was like breaking the Enigma code. Except this time, the messages weren't from an enemy army. They were from criminals planning shipments. The encrypted phones gave the gangs confidence. What they didn't realise was that each message they sent was moving them closer to exposure. And once those words were captured, everything else, routes, money, stash houses, was already within reach. The digital barrier had fallen. Now it was time to follow the trail on the ground. Once the encrypted chats were cracked, the pace changed. For weeks, investigators had been watching and listening. Now they were ready to move. Over 10 days in July 2020, coordinated raids swept through the West Midlands and London. 10 men, 10 roles, 1 network. Each arrest came with new evidence, new context, and another piece of the story that was no longer hidden. Among the early leads was a name that kept surfacing in the decoded messages. Mohammed Usman, 29, a courier, trusted, quiet, easy to miss. Surveillance picked him up on the move, collecting a set of tyres in the West Midlands. Nothing suspicious on the surface, just car parts. He loaded them, drove south and stopped on a quiet residential street in Maida Vale, London. There he met Saeed Hashemian, 38. The exchange was brief, just tyres, passed from one man to another. What neither of them saw coming was the officers waiting nearby. The tyres were recovered within minutes. When investigators cut them open, the contents confirmed what the chats had hinted at. Not narcotics, but cash, nearly £500,000 in vacuum-sealed banknotes, hidden in hollow tyres, disguised as routine hardware. The tactic was simple, effective and well practiced. Disguise the money as something no one would question. Move it across cities, across networks, under the radar. But this time, the disguise had already been exposed. The handoff they thought was invisible had been anticipated before the first tyre was even loaded. It was just one tactic in a much larger toolkit. The chat had pointed to other concealments: industrial compressors, compartmented vehicles, modified panels. Each tactic was another layer meant to obscure the real trade beneath the surface. But with every new discovery, one thing became clearer. The cash didn't move randomly, it followed the structure. And now investigators were following it in reverse, mapping the network backwards from every hidden stash, every delivery, every sealed brick of the currency. The system had been efficient, but once exposed, it was also fragile. The tyres were just one detail, but in the larger picture, they were proof of how tightly this network operated and how carefully each role was played. And yet, for all the coordination, no tactic could protect from what came next, the physical evidence left behind and the people assigned to move it. With their messages exposed and their movements mapped out, the gang's carefully managed logistics began to crack under pressure. Each arrest brought new evidence, each discovery filled another gap. In another operation, officers stopped a van linked to the group and found over £1 million in banknotes concealed inside an industrial air compressor bolted into the vehicle's chassis. The equipment looked heavy, dirty and completely unremarkable, exactly as intended. From the outside, the van passed as a mobile service unit. The illusion worked well enough to move money and product without raising suspicion, at least until the details surfaced through the EncroChat breach. The setup showed planning, not panic, a clear sign of long-term intent. As Detective Chief Inspector Pete Cook later explained, the gang operated through a network of highly trusted individuals and a fleet of vehicles within hidden compartments. Everyone had a role. Couriers moved cash, drivers handled transport, warehouse contacts kept the stock secure. Their records held up, their manifests looked clean. The trucks told a different story.
Multi-kilogram shipments of cocaine with military precision. Some used vans with hidden compartments while others travelled light, carrying packages concealed in ordinary bags.
But the real product was not on any manifest. The most revealing moment came during a search of an industrial unit in Sutton Coldfield, just north of Birmingham. Investigators had identified the site through decoded communications. When they entered, they didn't just find evidence of storage, they found the stock itself. 225 kilograms of illegal substances already packaged and labelled for export. The destination? Australia. This changed the shape of the investigation. The UK typically receives imported coke. It doesn't usually send it out. So why was a British crew preparing such a massive consignment for export? The answer was economic. Street value in Australia far exceeds prices in Europe. Smuggling narcotics into that market would multiply profits exponentially. What investigators had uncovered was a reversal of the usual trafficking route, a plan to flip the supply chain for higher returns. It revealed something far more ambitious than domestic dealing. This was a network thinking globally, willing to take on the risks of international trafficking in pursuit of higher margins. Whether that shipment ever made it to the buyer remains unknown, but its existence alone proved the scale of the vision. The gang was not trying to survive within the UK's narcotics economy, they were trying to expand beyond it. The raid had uncovered more than the stash houses and concealment tricks. They had exposed a structure that operated like a business, with supply lines, shipping strategies and market targeting. And at its centre was a crew that believed it had found a way to outsmart the system, until the system started listening. The next chapter was clear. The people behind it all had names, and their roles in the chain were no longer a mystery. Once the supply lines were broken and the cash trails exposed, attention shifted to the people behind the system. The investigation had revealed more than tactics. It had uncovered structure, an organised chain of individuals operating under clear roles, each with a part designed to keep the machinery moving. Over time, detectives identified 10 men at the core of the smuggling network, ranging in age from their late 20s to mid-40s. Most lived in and around Birmingham. One operated from London. Their names began appearing in surveillance logs and encrypted messages. As each arrest was made, their positions within the hierarchy became harder to deny. At the top was Maninder Dosanjh, 39, a resident of Cheslin Hay in Staffordshire. He was not only orchestrating the operation from a distance, he was present at key points, including in the van carrying 150 kilograms of illegal substances intercepted in August 2020. Investigators described Dosanjh as the mastermind, responsible for coordinating both international sourcing and domestic distribution. He managed contacts abroad and assigned roles to the drivers, couriers and logistics handlers within the UK. These conclusions were not theoretical. They were drawn from decoded conversations and verified through direct observation. In court, prosecutors made it clear Dosanjh played a leading role in importing hundreds of kilos of narcotics into the UK and reaped the financial rewards that came with it, multi-million-pound profits. His sentence reflected the scale of his involvement, 16 years and 8 months in prison, the longest term handed down in the case. Seated next to him during the van stop and standing just beneath him in the chain of command was Amandeep Rishi, 42, from Perry Bar, Birmingham. Rishi was not a passive accomplice. He co-managed logistics, oversaw financial flows and maintained coordination within the group. Described as a key organiser, he was effectively Dosanjh's second in command, closely involved in planning and execution. When sentencing came down, Rishi received 11 years and 2 months, marking him as one of the 2 central figures in the conspiracy. What separated both men from lower tier participants was not just leadership, it was scale. They weren't handling individual deals or deliveries, they worked at the wholesale level, moving kilos, not grams. They built the routes, chose the couriers and made the decisions that determined whether hundreds of thousands in cash or product moved that week or not. They also maintained a low profile, no social media trail, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Their value to the operation was their reliability, their reach and their ability to stay just far enough out of sight until the network began to collapse. The arrests of Dosanjh Rishi marked more than the end of a trafficking route. They revealed the architecture of a system built for scale and profit, and once leadership fell, the rest of the network began to come into view. Beneath Dosanjh Rishi, the structure extended downward with precision. Trusted lieutenants formed the operation backbone, handling logistics, overseeing shipments, and managing the movement of cash. Amongst them were Mohammed Usman, 29, of Albury, Rizwan Ali, 34, of Sandwell, and Kamran Hussain, 34, from Harborne. Each played what the court defined as a significant role in the conspiracy. They weren't street dealers or middlemen, they were coordinators. Usman, for example, was the one who transported the tyres packed with nearly £500,000 in cash from the West Midlands to London. Hussain and Ali helped oversee the circulation of narcotic shipments across the Midlands, ensuring the product was distributed, collected or stored without detection. Each of them handled substantial quantities of narcotics or money at various points in the operation. That access signalled something crucial. They weren't just useful, they were trusted. Investigators described their positions as highly trusted, embedded into the gang's inner workings. All 3 were convicted and sentenced in line with their influence. Mohammed Usman was sentenced to 9 years and 8 months in prison. Rizwan Ali received a term of 9 years and 6 months. Kamran Hussain was handed a sentence of 9 years and 2 months. Their roles made clear that the operation was not only reliant upon 1 or 2 leaders, it functioned through layers of accountability, each role insulated just enough to keep the top protected. The next tier of the network consisted of the secondary facilitators, support players who made the day-to-day mechanics of the enterprise possible. Among them were Peter Masih, 44, of Halesowen, Mandeep Singh, 42, of Wolverhampton, and Mithab Hussain, 31, of Sandwell. They weren't moving massive loads or issuing orders, but they made the rest of it possible, handling transport, maintaining vehicles or managing locations used for handovers or storage. One might be responsible for modifying compartments in the vans, another might have watched the roads during transfers. Each was convicted of conspiracy to supply Class A narcotics, with sentences that reflected their mid-level responsibility. They didn't hold decision-making power, but their involvement was essential. And in an operation of this scale, even logistical assistance carried heavy legal consequences. Rounding out the 10 were the money men, Ashtaq Ahmed, 45, of Walsall, and Saeed Hashiman, 38, of Maida Vale, London. Unlike the others, they weren't moving product. Their focus was on cash receiving, storing and cleaning the profits from the coke sales. Hashiman, for instance, was caught receiving the tyre cash from Usman in London. Their work involved shielding the money's origins, sometimes through shell businesses, sometimes through simple handoffs. They were the treasurers, the back-end handlers who helped convert narcotics into wealth. Both were convicted of money laundering. Hashemian, the only member based outside the Midlands, likely served as the group's link to financial services or partners in London, potentially even part of a broader laundering pipeline. all 10 men pleading guilty, and while their sentences varied, they were all handed down in recognition of one thing. This was just not a disorganised criminal ring. It was a purpose-built network, with each person occupying a necessary part of the chain. Their silence, their roles, their efficiency, all of it allowed the system to function. Until it didn't. The downfall did not come from a slip-up or a leak. It came from something far more dangerous. Belief. A belief that their code names would hold, that their encrypted phones would protect them, that their compartments, their tyres, their compressors would go unseen. But now every role was named, every message matched to a moment, and the full picture, once scattered, was coming into focus. Once the arrests were complete, the courtroom phase unfolded without resistance. There were no drawn-out denials, no dramatic rebuttals. One by one, each of the 10 men, ringleader to launderer, entered guilty pleas. The weight of the evidence left little room for negotiation. According to court records, all 10 admitted their roles in the operation, with charges ranging from conspiracy to supply Class A narcotics, money laundering, to evading export prohibitions. The offences covered a tightly tracked window from March the 30th to August the 13th, 2020. Their encrypted words, GPS data, surveillance footage and physical recoveries had formed a web too detailed to escape. The arrests took place in July 2020, but sentencing didn't come immediately. The legal fallout from the EncroChat breach added layers of complexity, forcing courts to consider how to handle evidence obtained through the most significant digital infiltration in modern policing. It took time to set precedent, to weigh legalities against necessity, but when it was settled, the case moved forward. On August 20th, 2024, the courtroom delivered its final word. A Birmingham Crown Court judge handed down sentences that, combined, exceeded 80 years in prison. Those directly involved in logistics, men like Mohammed Usman, Rizwan Ali and Kamran Hussein, received prison terms between 9 and 10 years, each sentence tied to their control over movement, distribution and financial handoffs. Mid-level operatives, who may have overseen vehicles or served as go-betweens, were sentenced to between 7 and 8 years. And even those who never handled narcotics directly, such as the launderers, were given custodial sentences, 2 years and change, short but still significant. In some cases, time served in custody before sentencing would shorten their stay behind bars, but the message from court was clear. The scale and organisation of this operation demanded accountability at every level. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Cook later reflected on the results, stating plainly, "Our teams were able to trace the activity, identify the criminals and ultimately put them behind bars with considerable jail terms." With sentencing complete, the operation was officially dismantled. But more than that, it was fully mapped. Every player had been named, every role assigned, and the same structure that once kept their enterprise concealed had been methodically used to bring it down. What began as a coded network had now been made legible. But there was still one element that pushed this case into global territory, something unexpected discovered in a warehouse outside Birmingham, and it didn't point to the UK, it pointed thousands of miles away. By the time the court handed down sentences in August 2024, the frozen chicken coke gang had been fully dismantled. 10 men were convicted, over 80 years of prison time issued, hundreds of kilos of illegal substances to have been intercepted, millions in narco money traced and seized. The case had begun with a suspicious shipment of poultry, but ended with one of the most significant organised crime takedowns in recent British history. Yet, while the network collapsed, it left behind traces of something much larger. The source of the narcotics was never publicly named, but evidence points to a supply chain stretching beyond the UK, possibly through the Netherlands or Belgium, where South American shipments often pass. The gang's use of a British port and a food logistics front mirrors other international smuggling operations, some involving Mexican cartels. And then there was the Australian twist. 225 kilograms of narcotics packaged for export, a shipment that could have earned the group tens of millions in Sydney, if not for the timing of their capture. Some questions still linger. Who was waiting on the other end? Were other shipments already in motion? These details remained locked behind borders, beyond where this case could reach. What it did expose was the global reach of organised crime, and how an ordinary warehouse in Birmingham could serve as a launch point for transoceanic trafficking. This case also underlined how much policing is involved. The EncroChat hack, a cyber breach likened to tapping directly into the criminal's command and control system, allowed officers to intercept plans in real time. It showed the power of intelligent-led policing and the limits of even the most secure criminal tech. In the end, their disguise? Theatrical. Poultry crates stacked with powder are worth more than gold. But what lay behind it was anything but a joke, a calculated, far-reaching criminal enterprise. It may have taken years to uncover, but when it fell hard, and left behind a lesson. Clever doesn't mean invisible. Not anymore.